And we are back again. If you listened last time, we went through the first Classix Nouveaux albums. And today we're taking a look at the second one. I'm Ernie Manouse, and with me is the one, the only Sal Solo. Hello, Sal.
Hey, Aaron. Good to see you.
So knowing we were going to do this, dreading it or excited about going to the next album?
I certainly was dreading listening to it, that's for sure. And so knowing this was coming up this morning in my bathtub, I faithfully put on the CD. And I thought, oh, it's not as bad as I remembered it. And plus, a lot of those kind of 12-inch mixes and things that are on the end, I hadn't really heard them. I'm going to say before, I probably heard them at the time we created them, but yeah, some of those are better than the actual originals.
So the album we're talking about is Classix Nouveau's Liberte. Let's start with the title.
I seem to have been into French at that time. And so one reason might be that I didn't pay a whole lot of attention at school to any subjects really, apart from music and English. But I somehow was good at French. My mother used to speak 7 languages. And so I kind of wonder whether I picked up something in the womb. Her favorite language was French, and she was educated in French. And so I just seemed to have a natural ability. And when I listened back to this album, I noticed there was some French used in a couple of places, and something that must have been me. And so I don't know whether it was just an Edith Piaf moment, or in a way, I think it kind of crystallized my vision of the whole new romantic thing. These clubs that we used to go to, and Boy George and all these people were at, they were a bit like we see in the Cabaret movie, you know. That was Germany, of course, not France. But it's that same kind of decadence, you know, all the dressing up and partying the night away, no matter what's going on around you. And so La Vérité is the French word for the truth. Of course, the name of the band, Classix Nouveaux, has some French in there. And so I guess it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Thought that comes to me looking, before we even get into the tracks on the album, is where it comes in your life now. You had put out an album. You guys had toured to support the album. It's sometime later, you sit down to do the second album. Oftentimes the sophomore slump, they call it. Second album, always a difficult task. You have a lifetime to come up with the first album, and then you've got a year to come up with the second. Where were you headspace going into having to record the second album?
I think this was the opposite, actually, to what you described there, because listening back at it after all these years, I thought, well, this kind of really sounds like our Beatles moment, that at that moment in time, we were more adventurous, more experimental, more creative. There was obviously pieces of music floating around that we'd had for years, because the title track, La Vérité, I think I told you in the last interview, I'd recorded it twice before Classix Nouveaux in different versions. So it was out there waiting for the right moment. And I think, first of all, the new romantic thing was on the way out at this point. And so all of the bands that have been associated with that, I think we were all kind of feeling around a little bit for like, what's next? You know, what's the new thing going to be? How far can we go? And as a band, Classix Nouveaux, Classix Nouveaux did not begin with the first album, because as I explained to you before, we spent a whole year and a half touring around and building up the following and becoming more proficient, better performers before we even signed a record deal. And so we'd already been together 3 years or more by this point. And so I don't think it was really like what you described as the sophomore thing. It was more that we're ready for this. This is our next natural development. And I think really it was probably the peak for that particular band in many ways. It was obviously the peak of popularity. By that point, we were touring all over the place, bigger crowds, you know, bigger following. People had seen us on TV and heard us. And I guess we were a bit more used to being in the studio at this point. And so there were some skills there that I didn't really hear on the first album. So that's why I would say it is more of a Beatles moment to me than this kind of sophomore band dilemma.
Touring to support an album, different for you guys than having toured before the first album came out? Was there a different expectation, different demands put upon you? Now you've got to play certain songs off an album, and or did you not feel that in this in-between time?
I think we were always a touring band. We just loved playing and we loved the audience. And so I don't think in a sense we cared too much about what was going on with the records. And so we weren't thinking that we were touring to promote a record. The record just was kind of fuel for the performances, you know, for the tours and the concerts. And also, of course, we finally got our big top 20 hit from this album. So it did mean that there were a lot of newer people coming who probably didn't know the band before. And so from that point of view, there might have been a difference that we had to somehow introduce them to our style and our whole, you know, thing, who we were. But I think it was just an ongoing thing, really, from the beginning of the band, long before we ever released anything up until the end of the band. It was really more about the audience and performing.
Set the stage for me a little bit going into the studio to start on the second album. Is it contractual that, you know, okay, now we have to do the second album? Is it the timing felt right, the material lined up? How much did you have in place going in?
I think, as far as I remember, there was always a sort of loose schedule that when you're signed to a major record company, the contract does say you're supposed to deliver an album each year. Obviously, we played out the first one insofar as singles releases and videos and all that kind of thing. And so I guess the time, it might not have been down to the exact month when we did it, but at some point that year, we were going to record our second album. We probably wanted to record our second album because we wanted to take it further.
The first album, you'd been workshopping almost, I would say, the songs out in concert. For the second album, did you do that during the preceding touring, or was a lot of it created with the intention of the album or in studio while building the album?
Well, I think I mentioned to you last time that EMI used to have a demo studio on the ground floor that all the bands who were signed there could use. Most of the time it was us or Duran Duran who were in there. And so we were able to go in and we could just book a week or book 2 weeks and work out songs. So by the time we got to the big expensive studio, we were ready. So that's pretty much how it worked. I think in the EMI studio is where we really did all the working out of stuff.
Is it safe to assume lyrics is mostly you?
Sometimes perhaps might have given me an idea or a title to work with, but always it seemed to be that I was thinking about what I wanted to communicate as the singer.
Is it wrong to think of it as autobiographical? Is it wrong to think that there's a following the lyrics, reading the lyrics to the songs, listening to them, we're learning where you are as a person at that time and what you're going through? Or were they more generic in thought and ideas of people's reactions to things?
The great thing for me about, in a sense, listening to it after 30 years plus is I can listen to it more like a member of the public now, because I don't remember much about it. And I certainly have not thought about it and lived it for 30 years. And
Right.
So when I listened to it today, it struck me there are kind of three strands. One is the simply poetic. Sometimes the lyrics, I don't remember what they were about, but it doesn't really matter because I like the sound of them. And so they kind of say and even today, I think that would be my preference. You know, I had as the angry young man back then, I had a penchant for sometimes talking about world issues or, you know, big things, either protesting or hoping, you know, for change. That kind of stuff was there. But there's that, and then occasionally there might be something that's more biographical, but probably not too much overtly, because being a band, I don't think I ever thought of it as me expressing my individual thoughts and experiences. That's why later on, when I had my San Damiano era, I did it without the band because it was me. That was about me. It wasn't about them.
Yeah, so a different mindset then in crafting those songs.
Yeah, and I think probably experimental again, you know, trying different things to see what somehow clicked, what sounded exciting. it's hard for any of us, I think, to go back that far and fully remember the mindset of the younger self.
But we're asking you to do that anyway. I am curious also, are you imitating things you're hearing in the time, or are you trying to create and find new sounds? Are you saying, we really like this song, this sound that this band is doing, how can we interpret that? Or is it more, hey, has anyone ever thought of trying this?
Well, I think on the one hand, it was a very exciting time because there were a lot of new inventions in terms of machines and synthesizers and sounds. And I hear them on there, not just the new inventions, but us creating new sounds with them, which we'll go into as we go through the songs. And so that's a very interesting thing for me, because we certainly were aware of that this is a new time and we want to do things that have never been heard before. But I think inevitably, obviously, there were influences from things that you liked in the past. And so, as I say, I think there are some kind of subliminal Beatles influences in this album. Mick was a huge Bowie fan. And so I think I kind of recognize that in places. I mean, there's even, to me, touches of Queen and Pink Floyd in there, and also I heard Donna Summer in there. We can talk about.
Okay, I want to hear that one.
Unlikely as it seems, I did hear it in there.
We'll get back to Donna Summer. Okay, let's open up the album. You guys are starting off again with an instrumental. Pattern now, idea that you think it sets the stage, unlike a lot of albums in that time. Why?
I noticed that this and the first album, so essentially the first two albums of the band, they both feature instrumentals, and this particular one more strongly. And there are two or three elements I note in that. One is there's a classical influence there for sure. And I think we talked about that last time, that I notice in my music creation, even to this day, there tends to always be a classical element, which is sort of odd on the one hand, because I was never classically trained. I don't play grand piano or anything like that, but somehow it's in there. It's in there in my makeup. And the other thing is there is the experimentation, and the instrumentals on this album. I noticed there are more kind of interesting electronic-y sounds with the little beatboxes and things that were brand new then. And the third thing is the live element. We used some of these pieces of music in our concerts to introduce the concert or to end the concert. You've probably seen them. I've seen on YouTube some of the big venues with the curtains coming up and one of these instrumentals playing and all the smoke and the lights, and it's a very exciting beginning. It's almost like the spaceship is about to take off. And so I think there was something in there as well as the new inventions. You know, we're using some gadgets in there that had only just come out.
And I know Classix Nouveaux fans are going to kill me if I'm wrong on this, but this album was 1982, correct?
Remember? So, yeah.
That's what I'm thinking. So I'm sure if that's wrong, we'll hear about it.
Oh yeah, but in fact, the foreword on this album and the finale, they seem to actually be the same piece of music, but as sort of different versions. You get a kind of hint of it at the beginning, and then it drifts into the first song, and then at the end you kind of get the full piece with all the timpani drums and everything going on. Do
you know at the time, were you thinking of it as a cohesive piece, or were you thinking of it as songs?
No, definitely. Again, we talked in the last episode about how an album was an event at that time. It wasn't just some throwaway. And also I kind of noted, and when I reviewed this, that we weren't really a pop band as such. You know, there was a lot of pressure from the record company to always have hits and kind of be a pop band. That's what they market, that's what they make money from. But I think this band kind of fell somewhere between sort of the pop and the left field, whether you want to call it alternative or indie kind of music. And so I think we didn't have any fear or qualms about experimenting and going places that were not really commercial as such, But as musicians, we just felt we wanted to experiment there, or it was part of the whole tapestry. As long as you had 2 or 3 of the pop songs on there, you could do the other stuff as well.
Okay, is it a dream? Was it a dream?
Well, yeah, in a sense it was, because by the time this became a hit, we'd been together probably nearly 3 years. We've been doing all the things that I described, all the touring around the world. We've done a lot of TV. Been in, we had that near miss with Guilty, and then so this is like 1 year later reruns. So we had bad luck with the first album when our ace single came out, and this one, everything just went exactly as it's supposed to go. But the way it really became a hit in England, and I probably should qualify it by saying that it seems that for every different country, we have a different song that we're associated with. So for you here in the States, it's Guilty. In England, anybody knows Classix Nouveaux will say, is it a dream? In Portugal, it's Never Again. In Poland, it's Never Never Comes. And so that's kind of odd. We never had like one universal hit song. We had a whole bunch of different hit songs. So this is the English hit. And the reason that it is because for a short period of time, there was a national TV show in England similar to Saturday Night Live. And I can't even remember what it was called, but it was, I think it was even called, it was on a Saturday night, and it might have even been called Saturday Night Live, I'm not sure. But anyway, because it was called Live, they insisted that everything should be live. Now, the Musicians Union had some kind of a deal at the time where normally people used tracks, so they were lip syncing really on TV. And this particular show, they'd allowed the band to use the tracks, but they wanted the singing to be live. So there was a very well-established English band who was supposed to appear on that particular show that week. They're not so well known in the States, but you probably know the song Come On Feel the Noise, that's by them. And so their name was Slade. And in the 70s, everybody in England knew all their songs. And for some odd reason, the singer didn't want to sing live. And so it came to me and I said, I'll sing live. And then I got no fear. And I've seen some of the fans since then describing how when this strange thing appeared on their TV screen for the first time, they'd never seen anything like it. It was kind of like aliens. And some of them thought it was the greatest thing they'd ever seen. And it reminded me of when I was a child and I saw Led Zeppelin on TV for the first time. Like, wow, this is amazing. And so I'm honored that fans, young people at the time thought that. And the next week, Is It a Dream was in the top 40, and the next week it was in the top 20, and the rest is history, as they say.
When you think about the song, what thoughts come to mind, besides the fact that it was a hit? For you, what does the song mean?
Well, let's first of all talk about the music, because this began as an instrumental. And so the little riff that everybody knows, da, 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 that was the hook of the song. And I may have even created it on the underground train. I'm trying to think. We call it subway, don't we? In the States, on the subway, heading into the EMI demo studio. And so I think we recorded it initially as an instrumental, and then somehow somebody got the idea to add some words and vocals to it. So I think we probably did a second demo after that, introducing the famous shrieking and all that stuff. And so that's how it became a song. But I think that, since you ask about the message of the song, clearly this is, on the one hand, a slightly political song and a slightly kind of optimistic song, because rather than all the depressing sort of, what was it we said on the first album, Inside Out, so nothing much to look forward to. This was more, is it a dream that there should be no more fighting and all these things that we all kind of wish for in the world?
Yeah, promises broken, it's an imperfect world, lines like that. There is a line that stands out that says, sorry if I can't be as you'd like to find. And I'm wondering if that is coming out of the pressure of fame or attention coming to you, and people expecting one thing and you struggling with who you are as compared to who an image is.
these days, to these social media days, everybody's used to having everything out in public. And of course, the slightest wrong word that's said, and you've got an incident. Back then, ordinary people didn't have that experience, but suddenly when you're in spotlight, you did. I might be misreported in an interview or misquoted or something, and next thing, there's a whole fire to be put out. I mean, I'll give you a for instance here, which is kind of funny, and that is, you remember the band at the time, Landscape, right? And they did Einstein a Go-Go, and so the main person in Landscape was the drummer Richard Burgess. And earlier on, I think it might have been with the News before Classix, and he came to an audition when we were looking for a drummer. And so that came, I think probably the girl doing the interview asked me if I was friends with any of the other bands that were around, and this was how this story came to light. And she just said, did he get the job? And I said, no. And so next thing, he took offense. And so it was like, well, I didn't say he didn't get the job because he wasn't good enough. In fact, he was too good, really.
That was the reason.
Yeah, that was the reason he didn't, you know, he didn't get the job. Maybe he didn't want it anyway. But that's just an example of the kind of pressure that you get. There was another time, well, that was a bit later on, but there's a very famous English singer called Cliff Richard, who's like the British Elvis. I know he had a hit with Devil Woman or a couple of songs before in the States, but he's a Christian, as I am, but I'm a Catholic and he's a Protestant. And so one time the interviewer got asking me about differences in our faith. Next thing, she makes the whole piece about us disagreeing. And so I had to talk with Cliff Richard, and he said he understands, you know, that they twist your words and all the rest of it.
Before we leave, Is It a Dream? The falsetto, you want to talk about that at all?
It's kind of what I was known for, right? And so I guess when people, you either love it or hate it. And so obviously the fans absolutely love it and they want to hear more of it all the time. And other people, they want to put their fingers in their ears.
When you're recording something like that, do you think to yourself, now I'm going to have to repeat it night after night after night after night, singing it? Do you ever think maybe I should, or is it all out for the recording and all out? And
I think, and you can remember when you were young and stupid, right? So when you're young and stupid, I don't think you even think about those things. It's like, okay, let's do it. And
yeah.
And even in England, you know, I mean, I always think American young people are always very, yeah, let's do it. But even in England, I think for us at that time, we just didn't care. You just cast abandon to the wind, and so you just go and do it.
Okay, moving on. To Believe. Next song on the album, tone change from Is It a Dream, starts giving us that almost hearkening back to the forward, kind of starting to get that very moodiness to it, which is really what I think makes this album stand out and draws me in. Moodiness may not be the right word, maybe atmospheric may be a better word. To Believe, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think this one is kind of, it's sort of like classical music, but it's sort of electronic classical music. This is really a Mick song, and he used to have a little synthesizer. Back in those days, I've said this before, you had to pretty much create your sounds. You didn't just press a button like today, and there it is. You had to create your sounds. But I think the little Korg one that he had, it did have some presets. And so I seem to remember him creating what was kind of like a string quartet arrangement, but it was on the synthesizer. And this is one where I talked about the poetic lyrics. I've got no idea what this is about, but I love the sound of the words. You know, they really sound so kind of deep and philosophical and everything. And so I'm sort of impressed that I was able to do that when I was 25 years old or wherever I was. And so in that sense, I'm more proud of these lyrics than many of the others because they're so obscure and I don't know what they mean. And there's a weird part in the middle. So we had in our minds one of these old Busby Berkeley movie things you know, where they film from above, and you have all these girls kind of circulating like a kaleidoscope. And so I created these heavenly voices that normally would back something like that. So I had no idea, you know, what we were tripping on, that we thought that was a good idea. But you've got the kind of electronic string quartet thing, and then you've got this Busby Berkeley little interlude, and then you're back to the string quartet thing again. But I think it's a great piece of music all round, because I like that you called it atmospheric, moody. It does have a sort of interesting intrigue about it, and it is really a good musical arrangement. So that's where I would say, for me, that's a Beatles moment. It's almost like our kind of She's Leaving Home or something like that.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And so we never ever attempted to play it live. It was completely created in the studio. It was completely created in the studio. It was never repeated again. And so it is a kind of Sergeant Pepper moment, I suppose.
That's interesting. You mentioned about the visuals that you're thinking of with the song. So I'll take a moment here to ask you, we talked a bit about the Guilty video, the first one of these we did. I'm curious for you, the idea of the music videos and making the music videos to support songs. How comfortable were you with that as you moved away from basically having a point where you're performing your song in a concert-y venue, as you see in the Guilty video, to the more theatric and stylized or story-based music videos? Feelings on that as you go into this album?
It's important to understand that back then, videos were very, very expensive. Making a music video was almost like making a TV show. And so record companies didn't easily commit to doing that. And when they did, they usually expected to have a really experienced professional video director, so their money wasn't going to be thrown away. And so a lot of times the video directors would pitch their ideas and suggestions. Equally, although MTV had begun over here in the States, there wasn't anything like that in England. And so the only place you could normally see bands on TV, there might have been, there was one kind of performance show for indie-ish sort of bands. It was called the Old Grey Whistle Test, that was on once a week. And so usually the kind of far out lefty hippie bands would be on there, sometimes the American visiting bands, and they might perform 2 or 3 songs. And then there was Top of the Pops, where you know, the hit songs, the top 20 mostly was exposed. Sometimes there'd be a children's show. Now, I don't know if you understand the term children's show, because I don't know if we really have that in the States. But in England, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, is supported by taxpayers. And as a result, they have a bunch of requirements. I don't know if PBS has that here, but they have to. Yeah, they have to have certain times where they have certain kinds of shows. So every day from, I don't know what time it was, from 3 or 4 or something until 5 or 6, they had to have shows for children and young people. And so part of pop culture would be you'd sometimes have a band doing their latest song. So we did a bunch of those kinds of shows, but usually it was just the band is just set up and the band just plays with a few colored lights and that's it. The idea of the story video, as you say, they were not very common back then. It was really just something that was beginning. The Guilty video, you see, you refer to as a performance video, and it is to a degree, but also it showed the whole new romantic scene and the people in the audience dancing, and that, so it kind of captured the live thing and the club thing. But having done that, at this moment, when we were doing this album, as that was on the way out, as I said, so it wasn't a moment to be trying to do anything kind of new romantic. Nobody was quite sure what was going to be the new thing, because in England, trends would move very, very quickly. Last year's thing, you wouldn't dream of having anything to do with last year's thing. I don't know if it was always in the States as it is today, where everything old is great. But it wasn't like that in England at all. It was like anything that's a year old is not good. It's uncool.
I asked that as we go into Because You're Young, because around this same period, my brother and myself and our friends were making Super 8 movies. And we made what we thought was a great parody of Phantom of the Opera. And we used Because You're Young as our narrative behind the scene of it. I'm not exactly sure why, but it worked brilliantly. And one day I'll send you a copy of this movie.
Okay.
Because You're Young, one of my favorites of everything you've done. Take me into that song.
Well, Because You're Young did have a video to it. And the video was a performance video. I think it was probably, I think it was the 4th music video we did. And at that time, we were doing the big tours, you know, we'd had the big hit with Is It a Dream? And so we were kind of sell out audiences all over the place. And we had, well, the best light shows in rock and roll at that time was U2 and Classix Nouveaux. And the guy who stayed with U2 for many years, Pete Smith, his name was, he had done a bit of lighting for us at the beginning, and so we knew him, we knew how good he was. And the other guy who we had, Malcolm, was like an extra member of the band, because at that time, nothing was automated, of course. It wasn't computerized, so you couldn't set up, this is how all these flashes are going to happen with the music and MIDI and all of that. So, and he could play piano, this guy Malcolm. So he actually, I can remember seeing him sitting up in the balcony with all the controls and both of his hands, and he would be playing the lights like a keyboard. And right. So they were just, he knew every bit of every song. And so it really was amazing how synchronized the lights were. And he would come up with these great concepts for staging. And so at the time, I mean, they wouldn't seem great today. They'd seem really very primitive, but at the time, and we've seen this copied actually as well in other places. He made these huge lighting tubes at the back. They look like they just look like enormous tubes, basically, the whole back of the stage. And he had all different colored lights coming through them, so he could create different scenes at different times. So we went and set that all up in a studio, in a video studio, and performed the song. And at the time, I remember our manager Falcon saying, "It doesn't look big like in the concerts." And obviously it didn't, because it was just kind of squashed together in a recording studio, whereas we were used to doing the big venues at that time. So from that point of view, it's a little bit disappointing. And the other weird thing with the video, I don't remember who the video creator was, the director, but there's almost like a sort of a boy band moment at the start of the video where he has each member of the band sort of looking to the camera, trying to look sexy or something. And I have no idea why that's in there. Like, there's nothing to do with the song or how the band was. Anyway, let's get, so that's the video, but let's get to the music.
The song, yeah.
Yeah. So my favorite bit of Because You're Young is the little keyboardy introduction sound. And that was made on a Casio calculator. And this is fun. This is really fun because I told you about new inventions. And so on the first album, there's 623, which was played on the Wasp synthesizer, which I spoke about before, that I could carry around with me on stage. So next thing, Casio come out with this interesting calculator that has a keyboard on it. So it was about probably, I'm going to say maybe 8 or 9 inches long, and it had a mini keyboard on it. So this little thing, it was basically, for anybody that knows music, it's a 1-octave keyboard. So if your fingers were not too fat, you could actually play anything really on there. And so I created this kind of as a 1-octave riff that was just perfect on that Casio keyboard. And so when we performed it live, I could actually carry this tiny thing around with me as long as it was plugged into the sound system. And so that was a great innovation. I guess they didn't really take off because you didn't see anybody else doing that afterwards. But
I noted when listening to that song that it had a longer intro than most songs do leading into it. And I'm curious, pacing wise and thought that goes into that, is it just a feeling? Is it within the band discussion of, well, I want to get my moment here doing this, I need to do that, how do you decide in structure when the intro ends? And we'll go into more of this on the next album because there's more longer intros there. But I'm curious about that decision of when do we kick into the lyrical part of the song?
We need to understand that we were just all great lovers of music back then, and we still are. So we weren't really calculating, you know, is this the formula to get a hit or something like that? It was all like, hey, this is a great little piece of music. We like this. And
Yeah.
so I don't think there was any fighting about, I mean, even some of the instrumental stuff that's on there, I'm amazed that the members of the band, you know, didn't challenge me on putting those things on there. But I think we just enjoyed them. And the other thing that struck me on the CD of this, the reissue CD of this album, where there are some extended mixes at the end. And so there are some extended mixes of Because You're Young. I don't know whether, I'm going to just take a look here. I don't know if it's one or more of them. It looks like there might be a couple of them on there. And I really enjoyed them because we hear more of the instrumental side of it. And I thought, wow, I wish we'd have just done that, like just done the extended version and didn't even bother with the cut version, because to me, it's so interesting to hear the guitar parts on their own and the frenzied drumming and so on. That's really enjoyable.
Help me understand these. And back in the time, a 12-inch and extended mix was a big thing that came out also of songs. And I'm curious, for you folks, is it the album track is a cut down version of a longer piece, or is it that they're developed separately, that you're thinking of it as a single and then you're thinking of it as a 12-inch single? What's the mindset in that?
Oh, well, it was a very interesting process because you got to remember that back then everything was on tape. And so usually the songs were recorded the way that we originally played them. And so therefore, Because You're Young was probably a 4-minute song or something like that. And then because these extended mixes suddenly came in, we could have fun then. And so when you actually had your finished version for the radio, then you would kind of go through it and maybe say, hey, we could do a little bit like this. So you'd record your little bit like this that was just the drumming or with all the different things taken out, and then you record a little bit like this. And then in the end, the engineer had to literally tape them all together, and then you got your 12-inch version. And there are interesting things I hear on there, like I'll hear echoes or delays that are totally in time. And today that sounds obvious. But back then, I kind of marvel at their skills, because as it was all using tapes, they had to somehow mathematically calculate what they had to do with the speed of the tape to get the right delays coming back. And so there's really a lot of recording skill and mastery in those special mixes.
When you're listening to specifically this album, do you hear mistakes? Do you hear things? Oh, I remember that are little glitches that make it in, or little uniquenesses that are there that wouldn't be in a pristine version, maybe today, where a producer would go in there and listen to it 700 times and clean every little moment?
No. After 2 months, I don't hear any of the mistakes. I just finished an album I was working on in the last couple of weeks, and I was saying to somebody a couple of days ago, I was on a bit of a time schedule, so I didn't get everything as perfect as I would like. But if I listen to it again in a month or 2 months, I will never hear those things because you just don't remember. It's at the moment you're doing it, all the little details seem very precious to you. Like, I really want it to be this way.
Right.
But then you don't remember that. And so even when you want to do them today, where music making is so easy on the computer, what I find is you have to kind of retrain your ears every time you're going to work on something to actually listen to the fine details in a production that way, so that you can hear something is not quite right, something is not quite in. But the same person I was having that conversation with, I said, there's always a debate among producers about whether you should have everything completely perfect, like machines and computers can do for us these days, or whether it's human error that makes music great.
So what did you think? Which one is it?
It's both. It depends. It depends what it is. I mean, I kind of like that the perfection can help us make everything in time, that sort of thing. You know, in my old age, my ears have become very sensitive to anything that's slightly out of tune or out of time. And so I like to be able to correct those things. But when it comes to performance, especially singing, whether it's me or whether it's other people that I'm recording, I've learned that correcting them too much is not a good thing. And so if you can leave in as much as possible of the original performance, that's really the ideal. I know there's a tendency in hip hop records these days to make everything completely perfect. And so we hear all the voices 100% auto-tuned and everything taken out of them. And so that's a sound that, well, especially the younger generation are used to hearing. But then if you hear the Stones from the 60s or Led Zeppelin from the 70s or something, it doesn't really matter about any of the auto-tune or anything like that. It's just so great, the actual performances.
Because You're Young kind of feels like a young person anthem in some ways, but also as advice from somebody beyond the young, telling them this is the way it is, kind of. Your thoughts on what the song is actually saying?
Well, it's a strange time, isn't it? You know, when you're in your mid-20s, because you're not exactly young like being at school anymore, or that generation, and you're not the older generation yet either. And so you're kind of in betweenies. So I think you can sort of put on both hats, and you speak for the younger generation, whether or not that you feel you are in the younger generation, but nevertheless you know that your fans are. All your fans are always a few years younger than you, and at the same time you're getting a little bit more mature, and so therefore to offer a slightly more mature perspective on things. And the essential hook line, because you're young, there's advice from everyone, it holds true forever, you know, for every generation, doesn't it? I often see parents on TV talking about how their young married children don't want to take any advice from them. It's like, okay, you know, they think they're grown up now, they're married and they've had babies, so they don't need you telling them how to run their lives.
In some ways, do you feel, though, at this point now, you have an audience you're talking to and you're giving advice to them from the position of this gentleman on stage?
When you actually get a real hit, everything changes. I'm trying to remember, I heard somebody big talking about this recently, but when you're kind of almost there, you're not quite in the, you know, the elite club. And then the moment you're suddenly in the top 20, then all the doors are open to you. And so you get invited to all the parties, all of the media want to know about your every utterance. And so you are a different person, not necessarily because of the age that you are, but because of the status that you have accomplished or achieved. And so that's probably something that was being voiced at that moment. I can't say for sure because I don't really remember, but I certainly do know that was a big difference. Always, like at the time of the first album, because we hadn't quite broken into the top 20, we're always a little bit on the outside. You're not sort of far distant like people that don't have a record deal or anything like that, but you're not quite in the, you know, the boys club. And then you're in the top 20, okay, you made it, and so you're a star. And
Yeah.
it might only be for, you know, 5 minutes or whatever, but I think that's why people do want to hear from you, and all the time asking you your opinions on stupid stuff. Like with this album, we went to Israel. I guess Is It a Dream was #1 in Israel, and so they'd be asking me about the war and such, and I didn't even follow politics, really. I didn't know anything about it.
You had told me once, years and years ago, that later in life you felt that when it was early in these times, everyone wanted to know everything you thought, and you really had not much to say. And when you finally had a message you wanted to share with everyone, no one was interested anymore because you weren't the pop guy. And I think that's kind of an interesting shift that happens throughout life.
Well, when you're 25 years old, typically you don't have a lot to say about stuff because you haven't lived very long. yeah, some of the young people I work with sometimes impress me because I'll ask them an opinion on whatever, and once or twice the reply has been, I don't really know because I haven't lived long enough. I was more arrogant than that, so I would probably have never admitted that I didn't know, but I didn't. And so, yeah, it's true. I think for me personally, in my experience, my life experience, there's a big shift once you're over 30, then you kind of are more interested in things generally and you have a better understanding of things. But in your 20s, you're still on the journey getting there. And so that's probably why in the lyrics they kind of shift about somewhat from the sort of pessimistic to the more optimistic to the questioning. And that's part of growing up, isn't it, really?
We're moving on. 6 to 8 or 6 to 8. My confusion on this one, is it 6TO8 or is it the numbers 6 to 8? I've seen it both ways. And what does it mean?
Well, I'm going to say it's 6 to 8. 6 to 8. And it seems to me, first of all, when I listened back to it this morning, to be a kind of alpine folk song done on the synthesizer. In fact, this was another one that was done on the Casio calculator. And so
you got your money's worth out of that calculator, didn't you?
Absolutely, yeah. I don't even know what happened to it. I should have held on to it as a expensive timepiece. But the melody, I kind of not even remember whether it was something, maybe I messed about on the subway or whether I did it at home when I was messing just with the machine or trying to learn it or whatever. But it's just a little kind of fun thing that doesn't have any great meaning. The title doesn't mean anything because I explained to you on the first album, 623, how that came about. And so because we'd called the first instrumental 623, the ones that came subsequent, I decided just to give them numbers that followed on. So that happened. And it doesn't necessarily mean there's a 624 or anything. They weren't necessarily consequential, but they just had random numbers that followed 62. And it was it doesn't have a meaning. It's just a piece of music, like a piece of classical music or a piece of folk music that seemed kind of nice and fun.
We didn't mention this. Who's producing this album this time through?
Oh dear. Well, mostly it was us.
Right.
When we get a tiny bit further, I'll talk to you a little bit more about the deviations from that. But essentially, actually, because you're young, that one I forgot to mention since you asked that question. The record company, they were always trying to think of how we could get hits, and so they actually hired Tony Visconti to do a remix of that. And Tony Visconti was the producer and bass player for David Bowie. Mm-hmm. But he was very interesting and very workmanlike because he will only work from something like 11 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon in the studio. And that's his day and that's it. So if you were to hire Tony Visconti to do something, he's going to do 5 hours and that's it. He's going to go home. It's kind of like an office job. And so he basically just pulls up all the channels and gets the best sounds and all that. And in the end, it wasn't really much different to the original one because it was all just the sounds that we'd recorded back in those days. Again, they recorded to tape. Oftentimes, they recorded already with their effects and so on. And so there wasn't really much creativity that he could insert into it within those 5 hours. So I don't think we ever released the Tony Visconti mix. We just went with the one that we had done. With hindsight, I wish they'd have given us a good producer from the start through the whole album. But it could have been good or bad because maybe we would not have been allowed to do all the sort of musical experimentation that we did. But
that's part of the story that fascinates me with your group, with Classix Nouveaux, is the fact that because either they didn't know what to do with you or how to work with this sound. They gave you a certain amount of freedom in those days with that amount of money and this backing most artists didn't get. And you got to play and create and give us something unique and different than just a rehash of what's already being put out there.
I think that's a good observation, because the bands that were totally left field that were around at the time generally didn't get signed to major record companies, so they never did have the opportunity to just go crazy. And the bands who were signed to the major record companies were all about hits. And so they didn't really get to do the experimentation either, or have the audience, the following that was interested in that. And so definitely we were in a kind of unusual space where, for the record company, I'm sure most of the time it was very disappointing that they weren't shifting the huge numbers of units that they hoped for. But from our point of view, yeah, we were great lovers of music, and so we got to experiment in the studio, and we got to go and do our great tours around the world, and so we were enjoying ourselves.
Okay, the title track we get to.
Oh, this is La Vérité, yeah. This is kind of like an Edith Piaf moment, really, isn't it? It's a kind of dramatic big ballad with the French in it, and in a way, I'm surprised, looking back, that the members of the band allowed me to indulge in this, because I had recorded it twice before with the Muse, and although it changed a little bit with the French and the arrangement and so on. This is probably more personal than any songs I ever wrote. It's certainly the only kind of love song that I ever wrote, except it's really a love rejection song. And so I guess that it was my attempt at a love song, but since I never succeeded in love, I couldn't really write one about being happy and staring in the eyes of my loved one. And so it was about I'm in love with you, but you're not in love with me, kind of thing. And musically, it's quite interesting, because I feel that, as I said, we were coming out of the whole new romantic thing, so it's not robotic like music tended to be in that time. And so BP, instead of just playing normal kind of middle of the road ballady drums, he seems to have found a way of doing some electronic-y things in there that you normally would not find in a ballad. The other thing that kind of surprised me when it showed up halfway through the song was there's a guitar solo in it. And the first thing is, guitar solos were out at that time. Since we're in, guitars were out. So you normally didn't hear guitar solos in modern records. But the guitar solo was played by me. And I think that's the only time in history that there's a recorded guitar solo played by me. I noticed at the end, of the song, it kind of almost sounds like there's timpanis or something going on. And so it could have been, maybe if it had been written a decade or two earlier, it could have been done by the Righteous Brothers or something. And so that's really what I have to say about that.
All I can say is I wouldn't be surprised if there are many, many fans who have been at a broken up relationship point in their life, singing out the part about if your eyes choose to see and all of that, in their bedrooms, sobbing over a breakup. It is just beautifully encapsulated in the words, and so hypnotic and self-indulgent of, oh my God, me, poor me, why don't you love me? It works beautifully, and I think we've all been there. What were you going to say?
Well, I think it's exactly as you described there. I think I was kind of reliving my teenage years and my first loves, and always falling in love with somebody that wasn't interested in me. And so as we get older, at least as I got older, and I've learned to be alone, so I don't really care about that stuff anymore. But at the time, I obviously did. So it was a little time capsule.
It does have those great moments to it. You just have to love it. Good old big, as you mentioned, the drum ending, a nice way to bring it full, and a wonderful standout song, one of my favorites. So I'll move on so I don't get self-indulgent. Never Again.
first thing is, when I heard this today, I was really dreading this one. And it's because this was I think we made our second music video for this one. And as you mentioned, the record company didn't really know what to do with us, but they knew what to do with Duran Duran. And so they decided to take hold. I mean, essentially they were saying, all right, Duran Duran are having all these hits, you're not, so we need to, you know, do with you what we did with them. But they thought we were aliens, really, you know. And so this is literally what they did. When they took hold, instead of getting, I'm really kind of sad about this with hindsight, instead of getting the great video director we had for Guilty, who you know, was really quite a visionary, they hired some cheapo guy to do a sort of quasi-space thing. And they even had props on the set that came from the movie Alien. There was like a big rubber pod, or I don't know if it was an egg or something like that, with the alien. And they used I guess, green screen technology that was new at the time. And so when we got to see the final video, they have us kind of floating around in space, and it looks like an asteroid or something. And BP said he wanted to cry, it was so bad. And so I think that essentially sunk the song as far as England was concerned. The video was so bad. And the other thing that they did, so therefore you were asking about producers, was they sent us the producer who was working with Duran Duran at the time. And he had worked with Bowie as well. But the thing is, he was really an engineer. He was like an engineer who'd kind of worked his way up a little bit. So he didn't really have any creative input. So he didn't change anything that we did. He basically just recorded it. See, normally in the studio, you would have the engineer who knows all the controls and everything like that, does the technical side. And then you'd have the producer sitting there and being creative, like I'm sure it was with George Martin and whoever engineered those sessions for him. But in this case, the guy, he was an engineer who'd worked his way up. So he just got rid of the engineer and he just sat at the controls, and he was really focused on the sounds and not much else. So it was not very fruitful, because we probably could have used somebody who would have done some creative artistic editing and so on. But having said all that, I think listening back to it after so long, I'd say this one kind of encapsulates everything you either love or hate about Classix. Because it's got the amazing drums going on, it's got the kind of frantic bass line, it's got the synth guitars, it's got the shrieking, and so that was Classix Nouveaux in the 80s.
Yeah.
And so I can understand why a lot of people would hate it, but I can also understand why those that love it really love it. It's a very unique piece of music. Everything in it is something you had not really heard before or since, and maybe for good reason. Although having said that, things like the bass line, you know, there's this frantic octave bass line going on, and I have heard younger bands over the decades who wanted to reproduce that era try and play those kinds of bass lines. And again, I think there are some extended mixes of this, aren't there, on this CD? And
yes.
So in the extended mixes,
2 of them.
Right. So in the extended mixes, you can hear a lot of the drumming, which is really powerful. So yeah, this song actually has a really strong melodic content, and the chords are nice and everything. So in more recent years, I actually made a kind of very slowed down version that was not frantic at all. It was melodic. And the members of the band, when we talked about it, said, you know, this really does show the melodic content that we didn't highlight the first time out. And so that's sort of interesting. But it was #1 in Portugal. I think we got a gold or a platinum disc for this and for the album in Portugal. And so the Portuguese appreciated it, even if the rest of the world didn't.
There is, and I know this isn't your favorite when I pull out single lines of lyrics from all those years ago, but in here there's the line, "All I see is responsibility forced on me." And I wonder to myself, is this the pressure of being in this industry at this point coming out through words for you, or is it just words in a song?
I think I probably was expressing really what I was feeling. as I mentioned to you, there was a lot of pressure on us to try and make hits. And that wasn't really what we wanted to do, ideally, in terms of music. And so that was probably the biggest pressure, because if we didn't sell enough records, we were not going to get to make any more. So yeah, that was a lot of stress, really.
Does success make it more difficult to enjoy what you're doing? As you're now having hits and people are recognizing the album's selling, that pressure, is it building on you guys? Do you feel it within your group, your unit, how you're interacting, how you're looking at the music? Is there now debates about what works and what doesn't work more, and trying to find solutions to things, or didn't that affect your group?
No, I think the opposite. I think it makes things easier, because people treat you with more respect. You have everything is kind of open to you. And the thing about our band, looking back on it, is that we were not a bunch of kids who grew up together like brothers, so we weren't having fights and arguments about personal matters. What brought us together was that we all really, really loved music. And so as long as we could keep loving music, and so that was mostly playing it, but also creating it, we were fine. And so I don't really remember us having squabbles and that kind of thing. So I would say that it definitely was being successful. It was a good period for us around the time of this album.
Okay, another of my all-time favorites is "It's All Over." Love the sound. It just pulls me in. It's one of those, what do I say, earworms. And I can just, if I could put it on constant repeat, I would just listen to that way it drives.
This is a very interesting track. This is another one of those that was album created. We never performed it live. We never did it again. It was just done one time only for this recording. And you're right, it had some interesting sounds when I listened back to it. It's got that, it's actually a vocoder that does this kind of sliding sound that you hear coming in towards the beginning at different points. It's got the bit of sax in it, and so it's got that sort of decadent club, self-indulgent thing about it. I seem to remember that both Mick and BP used to dabble with sax from time to time. I'm guessing on that particular one, it probably was Mick, I'm not sure, but because he was such a huge Bowie fan, he probably liked in Man Who Sold the World or different songs that had a bit of sax, you know. And I was kind of wondering when I said "It's All Over" what I was really talking about, and I'm wondering if it was really the whole kind of new romantic clubbing thing, that by that point, the people who were in the club scene were becoming famous themselves, like Boy George. In fact, nearly all the standout people from that scene, Steve Strange and Visage and so on. So it wasn't this kind of just escapism club thing that we used to do as young people. It was now serious, and it was commercial. It was making money. It was selling. And so it really was all over. So I cannot 100% say for sure, but I have an inkling that might be what was all over at that point.
What I think is interesting about this song is I'm sure a lot of songs, people sing along to them. This one, I think you have to do an impersonation of your singing it. The slides, the sounds, you just can't sing along to it. You have to try and be your own solo.
Well, it's interesting you put it that way, because I think recently somebody either posted some kind of a cover version, or for some other reason it came to my attention, somebody posted it on one of the pages, and so I had a listen. I thought, oh my goodness, like, how did I sing that way? It's like almost every line is delivered in some strange way that nobody else really sings like, and or some kind of weird vocal gymnastics. And I think at the time I thought it was virtuous because I was doing things that other people hadn't done. So I was still in the mindset of let's try new things. But with hindsight, if I ever went back and sang it again, I might try and sing it like a normal person, really.
No, unacceptable.
Don't worry, I won't go back
exactly
again.
Like that. 1999, you record this, oh, what, 16, 17 years before 1999. Now we're looking at it 22 years later.
Well,
1999.
well, you remember even coming up to Y2K, how people were. It was like, you know, the world is going to end or something when we leave this century. So you can imagine 20 or whatever it was, 10 to 20 years beforehand, how far away it seemed, 1999. And so it's probably a bit like when George Orwell wrote 1984. It seemed like the far distant future when things are going to be so different. And so I think that was probably the idea of it, looking into the future. Musically, this is very much a mix song. You know, I talked in the last interview for the last album about his sort of he had his natural home was a kind of power pop, really, and so this is one of those songs that's really very much a power pop. It's got great drumming on it. And so from that point of view, it's a nice piece. It's not very electronic, so it didn't really sound very new romantic. It's more guitar and drums pop song, really. So it's kind of light relief from things like It's All Over. The more experimental.
Light relief.
Yeah, light relief.
Before we get to the end of the album, a couple times Bowie's name has been mentioned. And over times I've heard people think of the similarities between your vocals and his vocals. Do you see that? Do you hear that ever? Or is that not something you recognize?
Well, that's that's a bit of a strange one, because I really wanted to be Janis Joplin. I never wanted to be Bowie. As I said, Mick was huge Bowie fan. I mean, when he first came to audition for the band, my previous band, he looked just like Bowie. And BP was a big Bowie fan. I don't quite remember if Gary was as much, but I never was really. I think that I always had a great respect. You see, certain superstars of music, whether it be Bowie, whether it be Elton John. There was another one, I don't think he's very well known in England, excuse me, in America, but he was huge in England. His name is Brian Ferry. He had Roxy Music in the 70s. And those would be the kind of like the main three icons of British music from the 70s. So each one of those, I never felt a real personal connection with, but I had a great respect for as in great innovative artists. And so I would never really cite Bowie as a big influence on me. I don't think I ever had any of his albums, but inevitably, because he was so big, I heard his songs on the radio. I think probably Life on Mars would be my favorite by him, just because it's a great song. You know, even Barbra Streisand did it, so that's how good it is. But no, it's kind of what you could almost say it's coincidental, the similarities that you hear, because I kind of recognize that those that I mentioned, particularly Bowie and Brian Ferry, they have a very uniquely English way of singing. And so I had a uniquely English way of singing also. And so I can particularly see for the American ear, that would sound like something that comes from there. I think it's interesting that Brian Ferry never became really huge in America compared to how he was in England. But Bowie only really became huge when he started doing the sort of more Americanized funk stuff. Whereas in England, he was loved as Ziggy Stardust and, you know, the man who fell to earth already. And so Bowie Americanized what he was doing, but Brian Ferry never did. He always stuck to his sort of Englishy, very Englishy sound. And I think I had that very Englishy sound too. And so I can understand that people can see a similarity, but it's certainly not intentional.
Yeah. You mentioned Life on Mars, a very dramatic song. This is not the best segue I've ever had, but I'll use it. I Will Return Then finishes your album, a very dramatic song. See what I did there? It wasn't a great segue, well, but I got there.
No, I've got a better one for you. It's
okay.
It's Donna Summer.
Oh, here we go. Here's our Donna Summer moment.
Well, you see, when I listened back to this, it took me by surprise because I remember the beginning of it, and the end of it, but I didn't remember what was in between. And so it's kind of like the Donna Summer, MacArthur Park, don't you think? And so it starts off with a sort of ballady type thing, and then all of a sudden it sort of disappears into a totally different song. And it's, you know, this up tempo kind of, in the Donna Summer's case, disco song, and then even deviates into almost another song again before it comes back to the original ballady thing. And so I think this was instigated by Mick, and I don't really know why or how or from whence, but there had been a few, not a lot, but there'd been a few songs in the past that sort of did this strange thing. One of them was, of course, Bohemian Rhapsody. And so I'm not going to suggest that this is anything in the class of Bohemian Rhapsody, but I think the Donna Summer one is a better comparison because that was just what I thought of. It's like, wow, how do we ever think of doing that? Like, I didn't expect that to suddenly turn into this song. And at the end, it reminds me of Pink Floyd, because on the outro, there's all this screaming stuff. And so there's that song on Dark Side of the Moon where a woman just screams with no words. And that's what I was doing on the outro to this. And so it's just a very, very weird hybrid song. I don't think we could have got away with it on the first album. That would have been too early. But at this moment in time, when we were experimenting and trying to just find new forms, and we didn't have to be New Romantics anymore or anything. And so this was our, I guess, our sort of new musical symphony type thing that had all kinds of creativity in from who knows where. The beginning, and in fact throughout this album, a vocoder is featured a whole lot, but people probably don't recognize it as a vocoder because a vocoder, people think usually of Daft Punk, and so speaking robot words, but we used it all the time for different things. And so on Is It a Dream, the rhythm that you hear at the beginning is actually a rhythm box being put through a vocoder. You mentioned the sounds in It's All Over. The slidey sound that you hear all the time is the vocoder doing that. And on I Will Return, at the beginning you hear this sort of sound, and that's a vocoder doing that. I probably played it. I certainly used to play it live, I think. And so that was, again, experimenting and trying to find new sounds. I hear the synth guitar on there. It was one of the very early synth guitars. And again, I think maybe if it's a long song, but I think maybe if there'd been some different extended mixes, it might have been even more interesting if you could have got to hear some of the individual elements without all the other stuff going on.
I thought you were going to say so you could put more in it. And I think, well, there's plenty in it right now.
Well, yeah, I think we already had the kitchen sink always, and that was the downside of the self-producing. You know, if we'd have actually managed to get a really good producer to edit us, it would have been a good thing. But we did play this live a lot from that period onwards. And
did it exist before the album, or was it specifically written as kind of a closer to the album?
I don't think it did exist before the album. I don't quite remember when or how it came about. I'm guessing because it was much more musically ambitious, we probably wouldn't have had the nerve to try it before we'd actually made the album. And so once we made the album, we had to find a way of reproducing it. I mean, it was really even like that with Is It a Dream? When it became a hit, it was really tough to be able to perform that live in the way that people hear it, because there was so much going on there. And the electronic-y rhythms and so on were really hard. In fact, I think we started to do something then that we didn't really like, and that was using a little bit of tape. I think for Is It a Dream, we had a little one of these, they used to call it 4-track machines. They were like for making demos on, and a cassette, I think, which had these whack, 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 wacka, wacka sort of rhythm stuff, and then we had to play along with it. So we certainly had the challenge live by the time we did this album, because it was a lot more sophisticated. We had to find different ways of being able to perform those songs.
So I Will Return, is it a promise there's going to be a next album? Is that what you're hinting at with it?
I can't stay longer, although so many stones remain unturned. After I'd gone in your memory, sometimes I will return.
I might actually stick my neck out at this point and say yes.
Why do you say it like that?
Well, because it's not over till it's over, and so all I can say is we're aiming to have an album in 2022. Who knows if it will become a reality? We hope it will.
You finish off the album. I know everyone's gonna be like, why don't you ask him more about that? We'll get to it. But you finish off the album, you go back to an instrumental piece and wrap it up. Closing, the curtains coming down on this album?
Absolutely. Again, in my sort of memories of what this band was, the end of a great concert where the fans had a wonderful time and you had all the elements that make rock and roll fun, and then just when you're kind of all going, yes, then you hear this kind of great dramatic piece that sort of sounds like pretty much like Tchaikovsky or something. I could imagine in Russia they're letting off the fireworks, and that was really what it was. I don't know if I created it specifically for that purpose, but maybe I did, maybe I didn't. I don't remember. But certainly once we had it, that was the function it fulfilled. It really made a great closing to the whole evening.
Not knowing how things actually progressed, is there a point where you're done and the label hears the album, or are they hearing the tracks as it's coming along? How does that happen at the end?
I think they sometimes they might get rough mixes of things, or they might want to visit the studio before it's finished. Usually maybe because they're spending money on it, and so they want to know that we're not just goofing off or disappearing or something. But also they want to get an idea of what the finished product might be. Plus also from the point of view of the artist, you want to feel that they're interested in what you're doing. And so yeah, for sure, we would have had visits. I can remember the studios that we used for this particular album. There was an engineer who was a young guy that worked there who he had a lot of creativity because he was young and enthusiastic. And so we tried taking him on tour with us as our live engineer, and he just got completely overwhelmed with the rock star lifestyle, because at this point we were quite successful, and so he was getting drunk and he just couldn't function outside the studio, so he had to return.
But I asked that question about because I'm curious the reaction you get now from the label now that the album's done. What is their feedback? Is their reaction to it? Are they excited? Do they think this is going to have hits on it? Have singles been released as it's coming together? Or are you waiting for the finished product?
Well, they really are only interested in the hits. I mean, you might get the odd person that works in some department who just likes music and is going to enjoy the music. But generally speaking, they want to make money. And so we'd already had one top 20 hit from the album at that point. So it was successful. Never Again had not been a hit. Because You're Young was yet to come out and did not become a hit either. But nevertheless, they probably thought it would be. And so I guess they were happy at this moment. They're riding high. Well, if you get a top 20 song, probably you're going to be able to live 6 to 9 months off that, off the back of that. And then after about 9 months to a year, then you're not you're not in the privileged crowd anymore. And so we were still on the ins at that moment.
Tell me this quickly before we wrap up. Cover art on the front. We've changed a little bit. We're not in a cape. We're not quite Nosferatu. Now we're a little bit into B&D S&M, it looks.
Oh my goodness, that's what you interpret from that. I remember at the time, actually, one of the guys who worked in the record company said, "Yeah, you should be in a heavy metal band. That would really suit you, And I dare say Judas Priest, paid attention to this. But I hate heavy metal anyway, so I was not going to do that. But I think, again, as I mentioned, it was kind of the new romantic thing. It was more or less over at this point. And so we were sort of moving on to something new, but not quite sure what it was. And the other thing I get from this is how important rock photography is. And I recently saw a TV show about this where some of the famous rock photographers talked about their iconic pictures. And so this is something that fans, I guess, normally wouldn't know about, that typically record companies will kind of farm out a photo session for a day. And so if it's the record company doing it, then they might be looking for album covers and publicity pics. Sometimes it might be a magazine that they want to do a photo shoot. If it's the magazine, then you probably don't have much control over it. You agree to do it, and then you don't see it until they choose what they choose. But if it's something like this, I don't remember the specific photo session, but I think probably they were sure they wanted to have an album cover out of it, and they probably wanted some publicity pics as well. Now, it's a strange thing. You would think that if you have a good camera and you have decent light, it doesn't really matter that much who's taking the pictures. You're going to get the same thing, but you don't. The best rock photographers are really artists. And so we'd had some sessions with very famous names and they were horrible. And the guy who actually did this picture, Simon, I can't quite remember what his last name was now, but we absolutely loved what he did. And so, because with the band in particular, it's really difficult, because to get everybody looking right in the same picture, it takes a lot of tries. It takes a lot of shots, because you can have one where, you know, 3 people are great, and then one person's got his eyes closed, or, you know, is making an awkward face or something, or is just in an awkward position. So it's very hard to get a really good shot of 4 or 5 people. And I think his name might have been Simon Fowler, actually. And we absolutely loved what he did. And so we never used anybody else after this. And even when I left Classix with my own solo stuff, I always went back to him. And at some point, somebody said to me, "Oh, Simon Fowler makes people look more pretty than they are." So, okay, well, that must be why we like him then. We needed that.
But it's an interesting look that you have for the album. Are you going to carry that now through all the touring of it, or is it just a moment in time? This looks, because I know there's the videos out there where you're more tweed and the little cap and all of that. How does all of this play in?
No, we didn't dress up for the photo session. This was how we looked at that moment. What you're referring to was a later period when, again, it's hard maybe from here in the States to understand how quickly things would move in England in those times. Right. If something was 6 months old, it was old, and you moved away from that. One time, I think I might have told you this before, I was driving some kids to the beach, and in a minibus, and all the music that they were playing was less than 6 months old. This was in England, you know. And so if it was more than 6 months old, it was their parents' stuff, it wasn't theirs. And so we were always trying to move on. So sometimes we made good choices and sometimes we made bad choices. But definitely like you said, the capes and the Nosferatu was long gone by that point and never coming back. So that's the reason for that particular look.
And that brings us to the end of this album.
Thank you.
Any closing thoughts on it? Well,
probably just that this in a sense, it's not my personal favorite album that we did. I know it is yours, but I think for fans, this is maybe the archetypal Classix Nouveaux album. That all the things that people love or hate about the band, that they're there, and so you just got to accept the reality. This is who it was. This is who the band was. Well,
as you just stated, I love it. I think it's a genius album, and I'm thrilled to have been able to go through it with you like this and hear all the stories. And we've got another one coming, which we'll do next time. Ready for Secret?
Yes. When the time comes, I'll force myself to listen.
Sal, thank you so much.
It's been fun, and see you next time.